Hola amigos, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis? Soy Plácido Doménech y hoy en este verano ahí, en este xSummer.AI de xHUB.AI, tenemos un nuevo Inside X en sábado, no paramos. No vais a tener 2 programas, pero sí uno, donde vamos a analizar una entrevista a Dario Amodei, el CEO de Anthropic, donde hablamos de muchísimas cosas, ¿no? No la he visto. Estos programas, los Inside X, no todos los Inside X, pero algunos de los Inside X sirven para ver algunas entrevistas no muy largas con vosotros que yo no haya visto y ver las reacciones, las dudas, contaros cosas, estar en contacto con vosotros. estamos en un momento que esta ola de la inteligencia artificial no para y es al contrario, cada vez se acelera más. Ahí está la cantidad de vídeos, artículos, papers, libros, tutoriales, cosas a probar, programar, crear. Es un punto de colapso y yo creo que habrá que focalizar, habrá que ver cómo evolucionamos, pero es verdad que estoy totalmente desbordado. También apasionado porque es verdad que tener tal cantidad de cosas interesantes a nivel intelectual, técnico, de impacto social, creativo, de cosas interesantes, de ocio también, pues es una época evidentemente apasionante. Un Hugh, HUG, muy buenas tardes, desde el otro lado del charco. ¿Desde dónde? Y la verdad es que es una auténtica locura. Tengo una semana que viene increíble y mañana vamos a hacer programa. Hay algunos programas que no son en directo, creo que comentaremos a ver si los puedo hacer. Pero bueno, no sé cómo voy a organizar porque es verdad que pasa el fin de semana volando, ¿no? Pero bueno, vamos a desde Bolivia. Pues muy agradecido, abrazos también desde España a Bolivia, país hermano. Gracias por estar ahí, gracias por acompañarme, gracias por estar en el chat. La interacción es fundamental. Hago estos programas también para que exista esa posibilidad. Pero como os he dicho, hay un par de programas que quiero grabar editados, no en directo, y luego una lista de programas también súper interesantes. Pero bueno, vamos al tema. Bueno, esta portada la he puesto aquí porque me parece... No la he puesto porque he elegido la otra. Que por cierto, la otra portada, a lo mejor no... Voy a contar un poco la historia de lo que he querido reflejar ahí. En definitiva es que la era de la inteligencia artificial, la ola que viene, como diría Mustafa Suleyman, no va a esperarte, no se va a detener. Estamos en una guerra de supremacía tecnológica, de proyecto civilizatorio, de evolución humana. No te va a esperar. Ya sé que hay muchos medievos que dirán, bueno, podemos crear cualquier tecnología que sea, pero el ser humano, si no es capaz de asumirla. Pero este no es otra tecnología más, es una tecnología que nos pone ante un reto de cómo integrarla, cómo evolucionar con ella, cómo integrarla si nos hibridamos. Y el mundo está cambiando aparte de la inteligencia artificial, y la inteligencia artificial es el medio para liderar esa nueva era humana, esa nueva era de la inteligencia artificial, esa era del humano X. Entonces, como hay muchos medievos o gente que todo esto no le interesa, que lo ven como que tardará mucho tiempo, décadas, gente de perfil técnico o no, me sorprende, me sigue sorprendiendo muchísimo, muchísimo. Y me preocupa en cierta medida, ¿no? Y es algo que además, fijaos que cuando luego comentaré, ¿no?, lo que estoy escribiendo sobre humano X es, bueno, esto cae como una bomba, esto lo van a leer 10. Pero la verdad es que me divierte, ¿no? Porque vivimos un momento tan apasionante, excitante, disruptivo, de toma de conciencia, ¿no?, de despertar, o de miedo, también puede ser, de incertidumbre. El miedo a veces no es malo. El miedo que paraliza sí, ¿no? Pero el miedo que alerta está bien. El miedo que esconde esperanza también está bien. Vamos a avanzar. Bueno, y lo que os he dicho, perdona, que estaba explicando el tema de la portada. Y esta portada es un robot, una AGI embodied, una nueva especie robótica caminando en la ciudad, en una ciudad lluviosa, y encuentra a un hombre perdido, sin propósito, un mendigo, y le ofrece su ayuda. Quizás una fotografía o una recreación de un futuro que nadie quiere, que es la IA avanza y deja al hombre detrás. Pero depende de nosotros. Nosotros, también depende de nosotros nuestra evolución y la del mundo, y fijaos cómo está. Ya no solo el mundo, sino hay que mirarse cada uno interiormente. Voy a comentar una anécdota personal que me sucedió ayer. Tampoco, no es que sea importante, no voy a concretar mucho, pero fuimos a un bar de barrio. Y bueno, tuve una pequeña discusión con la gente que iba, porque al final mi percepción es que la gente está muy... No es porque fuera de barrio, del bar, sino... Yo veía NPCs. Me parecía un escenario de videojuegos sin ningún tipo de humanidad y conciencia. Y entonces, bueno, quizás sea el problema yo, de cómo lo veo. Y me alegaban, pero todos somos iguales, todos somos seres humanos, todos somos la misma especie, sí, pero no todos estamos en el mismo punto de evolución o en el mismo camino. No digo que sea mejor y peor, libre albedrío. Pero vivimos un momento ahora con la inteligencia artificial de decidir nuestra propia evolución, nuestra propia aumentación. Y hay gente o gran parte del mundo, yo diría que la mayoría de la mayoría, que no le interesa todo esto. Ni de lo que hablamos en xHUB.AI, ni lo que se habla de inteligencia artificial, ni de logros, ni nada. Y entonces, ¿qué hacemos con esa gente? Pues nada, no tenemos que hacer nada malo. Simplemente, pues, intentar luchar por un mundo mejor para todos. Pero claro, te das cuenta que quizá esto no vaya de muchos, sino de unos pocos. Claro, unos pocos iluminados, ¿no? Unos pocos iluminados, ¿no? Unos pocos que, como publiqué una vez, ¿no? Unos pocos monos que quieran atravesar el desierto y traer esperanza o evolución. El nuevo escalón evolutivo de la humanidad. Mano X. Lo veamos así, ¿no? Yo creo que Dario Amodei va a hablar bastante sobre esto, y de ahí la escena, ¿no? Y entonces esta otra escena que he puesto aquí es lo mismo, lo que pasa es que es una tortuga. Entonces no la he puesto porque yo creía que, yo digo, no se va a entender, pero bueno, la imagen me parece chula, ¿no? Que es en una selva, pues una tortuga robótica que representa la lentitud, pero va más rápido ya, ¿no? Y se encuentra con un hombre con un casco de realidad virtual. Es una imagen curiosa, ¿no? Da para película de ciencia ficción. Entonces, bueno, no la he utilizado, pero me ha parecido interesante mostrarosla y que no se quede en el cajón de la creatividad AI, ¿no? Bueno, dirige y presenta a vuestro amigo aquí presente, Plácido, Doménech, como no. Un programa de la comunidad de Inteligencia Artificial y Ciencias Transversales de habla hispana, 5ª temporada. Llevamos 160 programas. No sé cómo acabará el año, pero si acabamos el año a este ritmo, tío, algo tenéis que publicar. No hacia mí, hacia el contenido de xHUB.AI, porque al final xHUB.AI ahora, bueno, hemos duplicado o incrementado bastante el contenido por los programas que hago en solitario, que hacía, y algunos en podcast, pero ahora hago bastantes más. Pero lo importante ha sido traer a tantísimo talento, ¿no? Ayer tuvimos a Maximiliano en una X-Talks ahí, a David Vivancos, Merelo, a Emilio. Todos esos debates. Muchísima gente, ¿no? Tengo que deciros también que xHUB.AI tiene muchísimos adeptos, pero también gente que no nos mira bien, no gusta ni el estilo, ni la forma, ni la dirección. Sobre todo la dirección, los valores, libertad, transparencia, disrupción, evolución. Eso me gusta. Es mejor estar ciegos. En un país de ciegos uno tiene más oportunidades. 5ª temporada que no paramos, 160, no es el número exacto, cerca de 158, 160, a lo mejor son más de 160, no me acuerdo, podría ver ahora. A ver, vamos a verlo ya que lo estaba diciendo. 162. 162. Este programa está transmitiéndose por X, YouTube, LinkedIn, Rumble, Kik y Twitch. Sabéis que Meta, no somos devotos del señor Zuckerberg, de ese líder de la humanidad. Por lo tanto, no vamos a transmitir ni por Facebook ni por Instagram estos contenidos. Tengo que agradeceros también el apoyo que estamos recibiendo en el canal de YouTube. Ya vamos por 20.000, bueno, vamos por 20.000, más de 20.000. y vamos a por los 21.000. La idea es que después del verano estemos en los 25.000, pero yo creo que incluso a lo mejor podríamos llegar a los 30.000. En definitiva, es muchísima, muchísima gente la que nos sigue, la que nos escucha. Y a mí lo que sobre todo me sorprende es la fidelidad, ¿no? Al final, cuando uno mira el histórico, sin ser grandes números, a ver, están bien, ¿no? Pero no tiene un millón un millón de suscriptores, cientos de miles de reproducciones, todo llegará. Pero sí que es verdad que las audiencias se mantienen. Por ejemplo, en podcast me queda sorprendido, ¿no? En verano se han duplicado, ¿no? Por día se han duplicado. O sea, hay más tiempo y se duplica. Entonces ves que las audiencias no bajan, ¿no? Es decir, siempre se incrementa. Siempre van incrementándose y entonces dices, bueno, pues la gente no te deja de escuchar. Y además en podcast que hemos metido muchos programas en inglés, que sé que eso tiene poca audiencia en el sentido de que la gente si hablas en inglés, bueno, es más un problema. Lo que conocéis ya de xHUB.AI. Entonces, muchas gracias por el apoyo en YouTube, muchas gracias por el apoyo en plataformas de podcast. Si os gusta lo que vais a ver, lo que habéis visto o lo que conocéis de xHUB.AI, poned me gusta, compartid, comentad, suscribíos en YouTube o plataformas de podcast. Dice, mal ahora Andrés López. Bueno, a ver, Marcos primero. Marcos dice, pues los valores que transmites es lo que más me gusta respecto a otros youtubers de IA. Pues muchas gracias. Pues, hombre, hay gente que lo hace muy bien y todos sabemos de quiénes hablamos, ¿no? Y hay gente que se lo ocurra mucho y hace muy buenas ediciones, contenidos y, bueno, cada uno en su estilo, ¿no? Pero yo creo que si algo distingue a xHUB.AI son los temas que toca, los valores, la valentía. Bueno, puedes estar de acuerdo o no, pero es arriesgado, ¿no? Ya cuando empecé en xHUB.AI ya lo tenía claro, ¿no? Pero bueno. Y bueno, también es un contrapunto. Se puede seguir a mucha gente y luego cada uno que... Pero bueno, yo creo que es un canal necesario y además que traemos mucha gente. Vamos a seguir trayendo gente. En verano cuesta más, ¿eh? En verano yo sigo. Aunque algunos han vuelto en los debates y tal, pero las entrevistas y todo esto cuesta. Teníamos un par en agosto y las han pasado a septiembre. Pero bueno, va a haber contenido todo el mes. Gracias, Marcos. Andrés López, saludos. Mala hora en España. Sí, ya lo que pasa es que, bueno, a ver, esta hora es la hora tonta, que ¿sabéis qué pasa? Yo utilizaba, bueno, acababa a veces de comer, descansaba, o hacía una siesta o hacía otras cosas. Y es verdad que pues aprovecho esta hora, que en vez de descansar, pues bueno, lo que hago es ver un programa o un contenidos que quiero ver y bueno, estoy con vosotros. Y la verdad que se echa de menos, me he acostumbrado ya a no descansar, porque es verdad que cuando descansas luego cuesta otra vez ponerte en marcha. Y bueno, y así acabo y a lo mejor hago alguna cosa más y ya luego me voy a la playa o me voy a la piscina, me voy a dar una vuelta, a hacer vida social, la poca que tengo, la poca que deja esto de la inteligencia artificial. Pero bueno, y suele tener buena audiencia, bueno, los sábados, los domingos menos, ¿no? Pero entre semanas es verdad que hemos llegado a tener 200 personas ahí en directo y a mí me parece sorprendente, ¿no? Pero bueno, muchas gracias por seguirnos y estar ahí. Pero bueno, y quien no pueda verlo a esta hora, pues nada, como queda grabado en YouTube y en podcast al día siguiente, pues nada, lo veis o lo escucháis. Si queréis uniros al Discord, que tenéis que estar sí o sí, porque es donde publicamos todo, debates, papers, libros, cursos, todo gratis. Pues nos enviáis un mensaje directo, un correo y ya adentro. Estamos muy cerquita de 500 y nada, espero a lo mejor en verano acabar por 600. Muy contentos con la comunidad de Discord. Y si queréis apoyarnos económicamente, lo podéis hacer a través de Buy Me a Coffee, a través de PayPal o a través de un superchat, que siempre se agradece, aunque estamos buscando plataforma propia y monetización, porque hay que ver. Tengo muchas ideas y para poder desarrollarlas a pulmón es casi imposible, habrá que ver. Sí, ninguna idea de programa. Podéis comentar lo que queráis. Si lo hacéis con educación, sin problemas. Podéis comentarme lo que queráis, que voy a parar, leeros. Refugio Áureo, si me permites una idea de programa, oportunidades de emprendimiento en IA. Pero sin contar con subvenciones ni fondos públicos. Hay oportunidades en el sector privado para emprender. Bueno, hicimos un programa de startups en IA, está en el canal. Si pones startups, xHUB.AI, está. Y es que es un tema delicado, refugio. A ver, porque una cosa es en el mundo. En el mundo te diría que sí a todo, ¿sabes? Hay inversión desde el sector privado, con el tema de la IA que todo el mundo toca, tienes que ser disruptivo. Pero sí, el mundo está lleno de oportunidades y es el momento, además. No ha habido mejor momento que ahora. Pero si te circunscribes exclusivamente a España, a ver, es que yo no quiero un sábado ser tan negativo. A ver, el otro día tuve una charla con mi hermano sobre esto, ¿no? Bueno, también está planteándose cosas. Irse a España, ¿no? Trabaja en el desarrollo de videojuegos. Es que es complicado, pero no quiero... A ver, yo creo que España es un grandísimo país o el mejor país y lo sería mucho más si no fuera por la clase política y el sistema corrupto. Es un problema sistémico, también un problema de la sociedad y de los políticos, porque los políticos al final es un reflejo de la sociedad y antes es el problema social que el problema de los políticos, que es un fruto de eso. Y yo creo que lo vamos a pasar muy mal. Lo dijo David Vivancos y creo que aquí, mira, la gente está celebrando hoy, 2 de agosto, ¿sabéis lo que? Que ha llegado la AI Act, ¿no? La AI Act. La RIA, la regulación de la inteligencia artificial, vamos. Venga, descorchando el champán y poniendo diagramas de toda la regulación que tenemos que cumplir. Tú ves eso y dices, yo me voy y no debo cumplir nada. Bueno, tienes que cumplir cosas, pero hay mucha autorregulación en este campo, se está en pleno desarrollo. Mirad los programas que hicimos de las propuestas de Estados Unidos, el AI Action Plan o el de China, la respuesta de China para liderar en el mundo desde la IA. No hablan de regulación, hablan de recomendaciones, de colaboración. Aquí no, aquí hablamos de multas. ¿Y esto qué quiere decir? No, es que somos muy éticos, somos muy humanos, queremos hacer las cosas bien. No, no os equivoquéis, es un plan para someter a Europa y España a la pobreza absoluta. No pintamos ni vamos a pintar nada, excepto los mismos de siempre. Y la gente le da igual. Como muchos se preguntan cuándo va a llegar la renta básica universal. Independientemente de eso, hay emprendedores, se puede emprender, y en España también. Pero bueno, es muy complicado. Yo te diría que si no tienes otro remedio, o porque es un sector muy vertical, pues te toca quedarte en España pues, y en Europa y explotarlo desde aquí, pues perfecto. Pero si puedes moverte y tener una visión global, incluso mover parte de tu infraestructura fiscal, financiera a nivel global y funcionar de otra manera con mayor libertad, te lo recomendaría. Yo estoy también en ese punto de verlo. Y mucha gente. Y es una pena. Es una pena porque no tendríamos que estar perdiendo el tiempo en eso, sino en desarrollar e impulsar un país como España, una zona como Europa, que yo creo que tampoco Europa quiere que España esté en esa línea tan vanguardista. Y luego nosotros tenemos una alianza que está por desarrollar, también en xHUB, que es el tema de Iberoamérica, Latinoamérica, los países hermanos de habla hispana, o muchos de ellos, o la mayoría de ellos, ¿no? Entonces ahí no se quiere, ¿no? O sea, vamos a vivir una guerra Estados Unidos-China y vamos a ser vasallos suyos, pues bueno, pero bueno. Ludwig Paz, felicidades por todos los programas y la manera de enfocarlos. Saludos, Plácido, desde El Salvador. Un abrazo, Ludwig Paz, un abrazo. Siempre, la verdad, congratula mucho que nos veáis desde diferentes países, ¿no? Y además que nos deis siempre, el 99% son buenas palabras. Yo también, si nos gustan algunas cosas, también agradezco que me las digáis siempre con educación. Yo, si veo que si os decís, puede ser que también lo malinterprete y os pediría disculpas si se me va un poco la pinza. Refugio áureo es un problema de inversión, fiscalidad, cultural. Vale, hay un problema de inversión porque España nunca ha sido un país emprendedor en tecnología, etcétera, por mucho que tengamos muchísimo talento. Estamos exportando el talento. Decían 3 millones de personas que han emigrado a otras áreas del mundo. Fiscalidad, pues no se soporta. Es insoportable ya hasta para el pequeño negocio. Quizá para el grande, pues bueno, paga más, pero no creo que tengan la central, estarán fuera, tendrán que estar en España y punto. Pero la fiscalidad, la presión fiscal motivada por un sistema corrupto o por un gasto social insostenible, tanto en Europa como ya nos digo España, con una inmigración descontrolada, que inmigración tiene que haber, ayuda tiene que haber, pero descontrolada, ilegal no, y tiene que haber unas normas, y más cuando tenemos que dar lo máximo. No puede ser este cachondeo, pero como digo, todo esto sigue un plan, que es el empobrecimiento, La destrucción de una clase media que ya está destruida y el empobrecimiento de un país y una zona para que sea cliente o vasallo de un imperio, ya sea el de Estados Unidos o el de China. Y cultural también, perdona, y cultural también. No me acuerdo cuando empezó todo esto, no me acuerdo quién lo dijo. No sé si fue Kylie Fun, el autor del libro Superinteligencia, es que no sé exactamente, no me acuerdo. Pero creo que fue él. Bueno, básicamente decía que nosotros en el tema, eso antes de xGPT, bastante antes, que en el tema de inteligencia artificial, que ya se veía que iba a ser la bomba, no tenemos nada que hacer por el tema cultural. A ver, tampoco quiero caer en el tópico, pero para que se entienda, porque no tenemos mucho tiempo, quiero ir también al programa. Vamos, aquí lo que se quiere es uno divertir, pasarlo bien y trabajar poco. Ya sé que hay mucha gente que trabaja muchísimo, yo primero, pero la cultura no es de esfuerzo, de excelencia. Entonces, fuera están disfrutando de esta carrera. Nosotros no queremos ni correr, ni entrenar. No, queremos la medalla, eso sí. Entonces, es de locos. Y entonces da pena, porque esto no va a afectar solo a una generación. Va a afectar a nivel de legado generaciones. Entonces, yo xHUB, esta iniciativa, aparte que me dedico a eso, de siempre, como empresario, desarrollador de software, etcétera, por el mundo tecnológico, apasionado de la IA también, y trabajo en ello, lo hago también por responsabilidad, no sé. Todo este tipo de cosas considero que tiene no sé, era como... Nadie va a hablar de esto, nadie va a hacer esto, como nadie va a trasladar este tipo de cosas, y es verdad que ha funcionado. Lo hice de forma instintiva, aunque me apetecía, pero nunca había un plan detrás de xHUB.AI más que, bueno, una semilla que es la que siempre me ha movido, ¿no? Que el talento, la conciencia, ¿no? Esos humanos nuevos, y ahí no hablo de edades, tienen que cambiar el mundo. Tenemos que evolucionar y vendrán generaciones, y las hay también ya aquí, personas que tienen que ayudar a que el mundo mejore, a que el ser humano evolucione, porque si no, vamos a ver y vivir cosas de las que seremos responsables. Bueno, ya están sucediendo muchas de ellas. Yo veo cosas que la gente ni se inmuta y digo, ¿cómo puede ser? Luego gana un equipo de fútbol todos a la calle, o bueno, y en Twitter o en redes sociales lo mismo. A lo mejor un político dice algo que está muy bien, ¿no? Y que se critique y tal, pero las cosas importantes la gente le da igual. Entonces, claro, lo que me pasó ayer del bar, ¿no? Estoy en el bar, veo esas actitudes, me quejo y soy el enemigo. Y me tuve que enfadar un poco porque dije, vamos a ver, ¿es que no lo veis? Que estamos rodeados de NPC. Bueno, no voy a entrar mucho en el tema. Pero bueno, ya me entendéis, si ya me entendéis los que no seguís. Dice Rafael Navarro. Hola Rafael, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? A Estados Unidos, a China, Corea del Sur, o Japón. Ya, pues eso estaba hablando ayer con mi hermano. No, más que a USA, la zona oeste. Pero claro, bueno, no, os podéis imaginar la conversación por donde fue. Claro, es un poco triste. Pero hay que buscarse el futuro, si uno quiere desarrollar su vida. Y más si eres joven, yo no sé si España va a ser un país donde acoja, abrace y permita desarrollar su talento y sus sueños a gente o con perfiles como los de mi hermano o el mío propio, ¿no? Y me da muchísima pena, Y yo voy a luchar, no lo sé, hasta cuándo ni cómo. Algunas cosas sí que tengo ideas y estrategia, pero es triste, es triste. Además, siendo España un país como es, ¿no? Lo que estamos viviendo es triste, pero es la vida y todo cambia. Enric Sanz. Haces una excelente difusión y no te preocupes, la resonancia ni la repercusión, los avances siempre fueron parte de una pequeña élite. Ya, eso me comentan. A ver, tampoco voy a enrollar, estoy enrollándome mucho, pero bueno, los Inside X son eso. Yo hablo y luego vamos al programa juntos. Es un tiempo también estar conmigo, y si me preguntáis, pues perfecto, porque a mí me motiva más tener esa interacción con vosotros. Enrique, a ver, cuando empecé todo lo de xHUB.AI, hubo alguien, no voy a decir el nombre, pues estamos ahí medio enfadadillos, pero bueno, yo espero que algún día se desenfade o se desatasque la cosa, que me dijo que bueno, que había una necesidad de lo que yo hacía y que que siempre el conocimiento, la innovación, el arte había sido de una minoría, ¿no? Y que toda esta labor, si llegaba a una minoría, estaba ya bien recompensada, con que llegase a 1, a 10, que si llegaba a millones genial, pero era muy difícil porque este discurso, estas formas y valores iban a molestar mucho, pero es verdad que también iba a ser muy bien acogido por gente que no ve su discurso, no ve sus valores, no están ciegos y quieren sentirse menos solos a lo mejor, escuchar a gente que piense como ellos o no, pero que digas, bueno, tienen neuronas, hay un pensamiento crítico, que no, yo no intento que todo el mundo esté de acuerdo conmigo, pero la idea es que, oye, escucha a esta persona, que es lo que me gustaría a mí ver, y algo se mueve ahí dentro en la caja, ¿sabéis? Y a partir de ahí me hace pensar también, ¿no? Me hace pensar. Y entonces, bueno, pero yo sí que es verdad, también lo digo, que aunque he sido muy, no elitista para nada, sino muy, no sé cómo decirlo, muy rata de laboratorio, yo vengo del mundo tech, de estar en laboratorio encerrado, programar, y a nivel personal también soy bastante... pero es verdad que a medida que me he ido haciendo mayor, entiendo que hay una responsabilidad, ¿no? Y yo creo que xHUB.AI tiene que ser un movimiento o una iniciativa de impacto importante, no elitista solo. Y bueno, pero por ahí vamos a hacer muchas cosas y vamos a intentar llegar a mucha gente desde diferentes ramas y bueno, ya veremos qué pasa, ¿no? Y también hay que intentar monetizar, importante, porque si no es verdad que es complicado. Hugh, lo que está pasando en España es una verdadera tragedia, la destrucción de la familia y valores, esa es una cosa que tú estás diciendo. Que bueno, que lo que estoy comentando yo de la conversación con mi hermano, ya puedes intuir, no quiero profundizar porque, bueno, es su vida, es una conversación personal privada, pero bueno, ya puedes intuir con cosas que he dicho, pues bueno, pues lo que tú estás diciendo, ¿no? Es una pena que se pueda ir talento, que nuestras familias o nuestra gente querida se tenga que buscar la vida en otros países alejados, que no pasa nada, que no es un drama, que no se ha muerto, ¿no? Pero ojalá lo pudieran hacer aquí. La migración incontrolable, la corrupción, todo esto tiene que parar de una vez, sí. O será muy tarde, no lo sé. Yo ya llega un momento que dices, que no lo sé, a lo mejor ya es tarde. Qué bueno eres, Alberto Zenit. Eres muy bueno, soy fan tuyo. Eres el hombre breve, pero me gusta mucho ese estilo, siempre me ha gustado. La gente que dice poco, con poco mucho, ¿no? Alberto Zenit dice, no es país para jóvenes, autóctonos, voy a decir, él dice autóctonos y también autónomos, ¿no? Pero sí, no, es muy triste eso. Un país tiene que ser para jóvenes, pero para jóvenes de edad y de espíritu, ¿no? Lo que representa la juventud, el espíritu joven, ¿me entendéis, no? Y es muy triste eso. Y la conversación fue por ahí y joder, para mí es un fracaso. ¿Sabéis lo que pienso? Que, digo, cuando yo empecé en esto tenía... si hablo de esto es mejor que no hable, me emocionaría. Pero empecé con 22 años, luchando por los mismos valores y al final, cuando veo que tengo ahora 50, digo, hostia, pues a lo mejor he fracasado. Pero pienso que no, porque he tenido una gran evolución, ¿no? Pero siempre pienso, podías haber hecho mucho más, ¿no? Y bueno, al final uno no puede ser tan duro con uno mismo. Uno puede autoexigirse, pero tampoco, joder, ya tienes que tener exigencia, pero tiene que tener amor propio, decir, has hecho lo que has podido, eres humano, ¿no? Y seguir luchando. Y también colaborar, ¿no? Buscar en este sentido. Pero sí, tengo esas reflexiones, sí. En India, bueno, estás comentando mucho, entonces no vamos a ver el programa, pero no pasa nada, es muy gratificante y todos aprendemos y vemos las curiosidades o inquietudes que tenéis. A ver, Rafael Navarro, en India también hay necesidad de ingeniería de calidad. Buen destino. Ya, pero cuando uno piensa que te vas a ir a India pudiendo estar aquí en España, piénsalo. Yo no digo que irse a otro país sea algo malo, incluso puede ser muy positivo. Pero una cosa es que puedas irte para luego pensamiento de volver, pero luego cuando dices, no, es que aquí no hay oportunidades de hacer una familia, tener una casa, un hogar, desarrollarme. Hugh, el sanchismo quiere acabar con toda la gente que como vosotros está peleando por recuperar los valores, dando la instrucción a los que están despiertos. Ya, pero sabiendo cómo opino del sanchismo y todo lo que está ocurriendo en España, no creo que solo sea de... es que hay mucho más detrás ahí. Hay mucho más detrás. Pero sí, suscribo lo que dices, ¿no? Y Enric Sanz, con élite quiere decir minoritario. Sí, exacto, como el arte, el ballet, la literatura, la música, la ciencia, sí. Hay una parte que quiero hacer, estoy pensándolo, lo quiero, yo que analizo, y es un poco lo que tú estás comentando, Enric, ¿no? Ahora a la hora de hacer formación, contenidos, bueno, vamos a hacer lo del kit que ahora comentaré, los kits de la gente que hay, que es lo que dedicaré más tiempo este fin de semana, para acabarlo ya, al menos tener una primera versión, aunque luego lo vaya, le vayan añadiendo cosas más tarde. Que sea eso, ¿no? Que también xHUB.AI sea como, bueno, a mí me dijeron, tiene que ser como, no sé cómo, las abadías, ¿no? De la época medieval, donde se protegía el conocimiento, ¿no? Se protegía el conocimiento, el talento, pero me gusta esa visión, ¿no? De defender, como en Alejandría, ¿no? Pero es triste también pensar que eso es minoritario, ¿no? Pero también cuando uno ve la historia dices, pero bueno, pero Plácido, puedes mejorar el mundo, pero no cambiarlo, cada uno elegirá, ¿no? Pero bueno, pues intento no volverme loco con esto y al final intentar decir lo que pienso y que pase lo que Dios quiera y ya está. Bueno, el reto es YouTube 25, que yo creo que vamos a subirlo a 30.000, iVoox 6.000, llevamos 5.500 creo, y Discord 600, así que quien no esté en alguna de estas cosas, y bueno, la noticia de la semana, bueno, noticias de esta semana o de la que viene, estoy emocionado porque, bueno, es la semana que viene, creo que me han dicho el miércoles, pero no sé si será antes o después. Ronda 2 de Inversión Racional. Sabéis que mi entrevista en el canal de Inversión Racional, un canal excelente, dirigido por Luis Miguel Ortiz, digo Luis Miguel, no sé, el cantante, ¿no? Que me encanta. Luis Miguel Ortiz. Un auténtico crack, un canal de inversión. La primera entrevista, 269.000, casi 270.000 reproducciones, una de las charlas de inteligencia artificial en español más vistas del canal y en general. Y bueno, mucha gente me conocéis por ahí también. Y vamos, la semana que viene la ronda 2, que ya está grabada, la entrevista ya se grabó. Y va a impactar. Es la intuición que tengo, ¿no? También va a provocar, ya lo sé, muchas opiniones a favor y muchas opiniones, este tío qué cojones está diciendo, ¿no? Perfecto. Que la disfrutéis. La espero con ansias. Además, con la calidad que hacen todos los contenidos el canal de Inversión Racional, ¿no? Una frase que repetiré, somos la historia de la humanidad, ¿no? Es un análisis sobre el momento actual, sobre las oportunidades, presente, futuro, una visión humana, ¿no? Pero muy disruptiva. Quería trasladar algo nuevo. Muchas veces siempre son los mismos discursos. Y nada, semana que viene, ¿de acuerdo? Ya no queda nada. Qué fuerza tiene esta imagen, el robot en una cueva tocando la pintura rupestre de la mano, ¿no? Del hombre. El futuro tocando el pasado. El mono mirando el fuego, ¿no? Qué momento tan apasionante. Y bueno, hay varios programas que quedan pendientes para editar, pero concretamente van a ser dos. Uno, el tercer episodio. Por este fin de semana lo que quiero es hacerlo del kit de Agentic.AI. Y luego el Selfish Ledger, el episodio 3. Sé que muchos estarán pegando saltos de alegría. Porque es como lo de Lambda, ¿no? Hay programas que se convierten en leyenda. Porque tienen seguidores como fieles, ¿no? Y es como se queda la serie corta, se corta la serie y bueno, queda un episodio y puede ser que a lo mejor dos, no lo sé. Pero voy a intentar grabar un episodio más de Selfish Ledger y luego ya estoy haciendo el análisis, me lo he pensado porque es largo, pero el análisis del texto de la Iglesia Católica sobre la inteligencia artificial antigua et nova. Lo haremos por episodios, lo haré analizando el texto que leerá Alma, la inteligencia artificial de xHUB.AI, y bueno, va a ser divertido. Y algunos programas, no sé si lo haremos mañana o el lunes, pero haremos un programa sobre ARCH-ASI, la primera superinteligencia. Es un paper que ha salido muy interesante. Hay varios, hay 2 o 3 papers interesantes. Sabéis también que estoy escribiendo cosas sobre humano X, hemos hablado mucho, no voy a comentar nada. Y que el kit xHUB.AI 2025 de agosto, el lunes, hago lo imposible para que lo podáis pedir. Irá evolucionando, iré incorporando cosas, pero todo lo que he ido recopilando, que no es poco, tampoco una locura, pero estas cosas que están bien, que he utilizado internamente, pues bueno, lo tendréis disponible. Es una recopilación de documentos que os puede servir. No es nada a nivel de formación propio y será gratuito, todo gratis. En principio se enviará un enlace de descarga, pero bueno, la idea es que a lo mejor luego se ponga en GitHub de forma pública. Bueno, ya vemos cómo evoluciona, pero en definitiva algo gratis, ¿vale? Vale, pues vamos a ello. Vamos a por la entrevista, vamos a por Dario Amodei. Vamos a ver qué nos dice. Vamos a ver un segundo. Pongo así y vamos a ver qué dice.
I get very angry when people call me a doomer. When someone's like, this guy's a doomer, he wants to slow things down. You heard what I just said. Like, my father died because of, cures that, could have happened a few years later. I understand the benefit of this technology.
I'm sure you've heard the criticism from people like Jensen who say, well, Dario thinks he's the only one who can build this safely and therefore wants to control the entire industry.
I've never said anything like that. That's an outrageous lie. That's the most outrageous lie I've ever heard.
Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei joins us to talk about the path forward for artificial intelligence, whether generative AI is a good business, and to fire back at those who call him a doomer. And he's here with us in studio at Anthropic headquarters in San Francisco. Dario, it's great to see you again. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So let's recap the past couple months for you. You said AI could wipe out half of entry-level white-collar jobs. You cut off Windsurf's access to Anthropic's top-tier models when you learned that OpenAI was going to acquire them. You asked the government for export controls and annoyed NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang. What's gotten into you?
I think Anthropic, myself and Anthropic are always focused on kind of trying to do and say the things that we believe. And I think as we've gotten more close to AI systems that are more powerful, I think I've wanted to say those things, more forcefully, more publicly, to make the point clearer. I've been saying for many years that, we have these, we can talk in detail about them, but, we have these scaling laws. AI systems are getting more powerful. They're going from the level of, a few years ago, they were barely coherent. Now, a couple years ago, they were at the level of a smart high school student. Now we're getting to smart college student, PhD, and they're starting to apply across the economy. And so I think all the issues related to AI, ranging from kind of the national security issues to the economic issues, are starting to become quite near to where we to where we're actually going to face them. And so I think as these problems have come closer, even though in some form Anthropic has been saying these things for a while, I think the urgency of these things has gone up. And I want to make sure that we say what we believe and that we warn the world about the possible downsides. Even though, no one can say what's going to happen, we're saying what we think might happen, what we think is likely to happen. We back it up as best we can, although it's often, extrapolations about the future where no one can be sure. But I think we see ourselves as kind of having a duty to kind of warn the world about what's going to happen. And that's not to say, I think there's an incredible number of positive applications of AI, right? I've kind of continued to talk about that. I wrote this essay, Machines of Loving Grace. I feel, in fact, that I and Anthropic have often been able to do a better job of articulating the benefits of AI than some of the people who call themselves optimists or accelerationists. So I think we probably appreciate the benefits more than anyone. But for exactly the same reason, because we can have such a good world if we get everything right, I feel obligated to warn about the risks.
So all of this is coming from your timeline. Basically, it seems like you have a shorter timeline than most, And so you were feeling a sense of urgency to get out there because you think that this is imminent.
Yes, I'm not sure. I think it's very hard to predict, particularly on the societal side. So if you say, when are people going to deploy AI, or when are companies going to use, X dollars of spend of AI, or when will AI be used in these applications, or when will it drive these medical cures? That's kind of harder to say. I think the underlying technology is more predictable, but still uncertain. Still no one knows. But I think on the underlying technology, I've started to become more confident. There isn't no uncertainty about it. I think the exponential that we're on could kind of still, could totally peter out. I think there's maybe 20 or 25% chance that sometime in the next 2 years, the models just stop getting better for reasons we don't understand, or maybe reasons we do understand, like, data or compute availability. And then everything I'm saying just seems totally silly, and everyone makes fun of me for all the warnings I've made. And I'm just totally fine with that, given the distribution that I see.
And so I should say that our conversation is part of a profile I'm writing about you. I've spoken with more than 24 people who've worked with you, who know you, who've competed with you, and I'm going to link that in the show notes. If anybody wants to read it, it's free to read. But one of the themes that has come through across everybody I've spoken with is that you have about the shortest timeline of any of the major lab leaders, and you just referenced it just now. So why do you have such a short timeline, and why should we believe in yours?
Yeah, it really depends what you mean by timeline. So one thing, and I've been consistent on this over the years, is there are these terms in the AI world like AGI and superintelligence. Like, you'll hear leaders of companies say, we've achieved AGI, we're moving on to superintelligence, or like, it's really exciting that someone stopped working on AGI and started working on superintelligence. So I think these terms are totally meaningless. I don't know what AGI is. I don't know what superintelligence is. It sounds like a marketing term.
It is marketing.
It sounds like something designed to activate people's dopamine. So you'll see in public, I never use those terms, and I'm actually careful to criticize the use of those terms. But I think despite that, I am indeed one of the most bullish about AI capabilities improving very fast. The thing I think is real, that I've said over and over again, is the exponential. The idea that every few months we get an AI model that is better than the AI model we got before, and that we get that by investing more compute in AI models, more data, more new types of training models. Initially, this was done by what's called pre-training, which is when you just feed a bunch of data from the internet into the model. Now we have a second stage that's reinforcement learning, or test time compute, or reasoning, or whatever you want to call it. I think of it as a second stage that involves reinforcement learning. Now both of those things are scaling up together, as we've seen with our models and as we've seen with models from other companies. And I don't see anything blocking the further scaling of that. There's some stuff about, how do we broaden the tasks? On the RL side of it, we've seen more progress on, say, math and code, where the models are, getting pretty close to like a high professional level, and less on more subjective tasks. But I think that is very much a temporary obstacle. So when I look at it, I see this exponential, and I say, look, people aren't very good at making sense of exponentials, right? Like, if something is doubling every 6 months, then 2 years before it happens, it looks like it's only 1/16 of the way there. And so we are sitting here in the middle of 2025, and the models are really starting to explode in terms of the economy, right? If you look at the capabilities of the model, they're starting to saturate all the benchmarks. If you look at revenue, and Anthropic's revenue every year has grown 10x. Every year we're kind of conservative, and we say, it can't grow 10x. This time, I never assume anything, and actually always am very conservative in saying, I think it's going to slow down on the business side. But we went from 0 to 100 million in 2023. We went from 100 million to $1 billion in 2024. And this year, in this first half of the year, we've gone from 1 billion to, I think as of speaking today, it's well above 4. It might be 4.5. And so if you think about it, suppose that exponential continued for 2 years. I'm not saying it will, but suppose it continued for 2 years. You're like well into the 100 billions. I'm not saying that'll happen. I'm saying the situation is that when you're on an exponential, you can really get fooled by it. 2 years away from when the exponential goes totally crazy, it looks like it's just starting to be a thing. And so that's the fundamental dynamic. We saw that with the internet in the 90s, right? Where it was like, networking speeds and the underlying speed of the computers were getting fast. And over a few years, it became possible to basically build a digital global communications network on top of all this when it wasn't possible just a few years ago. And almost no one, except for a few people, really saw the implications of that and how fast it would happen. And so that's where I'm coming from. That's what I think. Now, I don't know, like if a bunch of satellites crashed, maybe the internet would have taken longer. If there was an economic crash, maybe it would have taken a little longer. So we can't be sure of the exact timelines, but I think people are getting fooled by the exponential and not realizing how fast it might be, how fast I think it probably will, although I'm not sure.
But so many folks in the AI industry are talking about diminishing returns from scaling now. That really doesn't fit with the vision you just laid out. Are they wrong?
Yeah, I from what we've seen, I can only speak in terms of the models at Anthropic. But what I've seen in terms of the models at Anthropic, if we look at let's take coding. Coding is one area where, I think Anthropic models have advanced very quickly. Adoption has been very quick. We're not just a coding company. We're planning to expand to many areas. But if you look at coding, we released 3.5 Sonnet, a model we called 3.5 Sonnet V2. Which let's call it 3.6 Sonnet now, 3.7 Sonnet, and then 4.0 Sonnet and 4.0 Opus. And that series of 4 or 5 models, each one got substantially better at coding than the last. If you want to look at benchmarks, you can look at xBITE.AI growing from I think 18 months ago it was at like 3% or something, growing all the way to 72 to 80%, depending on how you measure it. And the real usage has grown exponentially as well, where we're heading more and more towards autonomously. You can just use these models. I think the actual majority of code that's written at Anthropic is at this point written by, or at least with the involvement of one of the Claude models, and various other companies have said similar statements to that. So we see the progress as being very fast, and the exponential is continuing, and we don't see any diminishing returns.
But there are some liabilities, it seems like, with large language models. For instance, continual learning. We had Dwarkesh on a couple weeks ago. Here's how he put it, and he wrote about it in his Substack. The lack of continual learning is a huge, huge problem. The LLM baseline at many tasks might be higher than an average human, but you're stuck with the abilities you get out of the box. So you just make the model, and that's it. It doesn't learn. That seems like a glaring liability. What do you think about that?
So first of all, I would say even if we never solved continual learning, and memory, I think that the potential for the LLMs to do, incredibly well to, affect things at the scale of the economy will be very high, right? If I think of the field I used to be in, biology and medicine, like, let's say I had a very smart Nobel Prize winner, and, I said, okay, you've discovered all these things, you have this incredibly smart mind, but, you can't like read new textbooks or absorb any new information. I mean, that would be difficult, but like still, if you had like 10 million of those, like they're still going to make a lot of biology breakthroughs. Like they're going to be limited. They're going to be able to do some things humans can't, and there are some things humans can do that they can't. But even if we impose that as a ceiling, like, man, that's pretty damned impressive and transformative. And even if I said you never solve that, like I think people are underestimating the impact. But look, context windows are getting longer, and models actually do learn during the context window, right? So as I talk to the model during the context window, I have a conversation, it absorbs information. The underlying weights of the model may not change, but just like I'm talking to you here and we're having a conversation, and I listen to the things you say, and I think and I like respond to them. the models are able to do that. And from a machine learning perspective, from an AI perspective, there's no reason we can't make the context length 100 million words today, right? Which is roughly what a human hears, what a human hears in their lifetime. There's no reason that we can't do that. It's really inference support. And so again, even that fills in many of the gaps. Not all of the gaps, but it fills in many of the gaps. And then there are a number of things like learning and memory that do allow us to update the weights. So, there are a number of things around, types of reinforcement learning training. We used to many years ago talk about inner loops and outer loops, right? The inner loop is like, I have some episode and I learned some things in that episode and I'm trying to optimize for the lifetime of that episode. And kind of the outer loop is the agents learning over episodes. And so I think maybe that inner loop, outer loop structure is a way to learn the continual learning. One thing we've learned in AI is whenever it feels like there's some fundamental obstacle, like 2 years ago, we thought there was this fundamental obstacle around reasoning. Turned out just to be RL. You just train with RL and you let the model write some stuff down. You let the model write things down to try and figure out objective math problems. Without being too specific, I think, and we already have maybe some evidence to suggest that this is another of those problems that is not as difficult as it seems, that will fall to scale, plus a slightly different way of thinking about things.
Do you think you're...
Bueno, aquí he dicho algunas cosas que a mí, yo me quedo loco con esto. Me quedo loco. Yo voy a dar mi opinión, luego cada cual. Vamos a hacer de estos 15 primeros minutos. Le han llamado dummy y dice que evidentemente no es un dummy cuando es uno de los defensores de el rendimiento positivo de toda esta tecnología y de su crecimiento, impacto y llegada hasta conceptos que él no defiende porque no sabe ni lo que significan, como agi y asi. Entiendo que eso es un error. Hay que contextualizar determinados conceptos que sí que llevan implícito un avance en la inteligencia artificial porque implican unos requisitos de los que él parece huir y en definitiva entonces, claro, entiendo que pueda tener un timeline como él quiera, porque al final si lo que ve es que estos modelos van avanzando, pues bueno, cuando en un momento determinado a eso lo quiera llamar AGI o superinteligencia, pues le llamará y se acabó. Pero no es así. Yo creo que hay una visión más correcta, es la de Demis Hassabis y Lesus Keber, que no hacen esas apreciaciones. Dice además, me ha parecido muy gracioso esto de que los conceptos AGI y superinteligencia simplemente se utilizan como marketing para la dopamina, para un efecto dopamínico. Bueno, lo ha utilizado mucho, Entonces, bueno, sigue explicando el tema exponencial, cosa que ya en muchos podcasts y en otros sitios y dummies o medievos, que si, oye, bueno, esto lo ha comentado también Sam Altman y mucha gente también, ¿no? Que por muchos datos ya que se pongan a este tipo de modelos, el crecimiento es muy poquito para la cantidad de computación y esfuerzo que hay que realizar. Eso no significa que quizás sea un decrecimiento, pero no ese crecimiento exponencial que comenta Dario Amodei. Pero claro, él como lo ve desde un punto de vista utilitarista, pues entiendo que la parte, por ejemplo, que comenta él, a la que se va, que es donde más fácil lo tiene y donde más impacto están teniendo, como es la parte del código, que tenemos que decir de Cloud Code, pues estarán forrándose literalmente. Pues nada, dice que ahí ellos no ven decrecimiento por ningún lado, que lo que ven es crecimiento imparable, ¿no? Le hacen una pregunta muy interesante, además hay un podcast donde me lo he tragado, son 15-20 minutos sobre que es uno conocido que se debate sobre esto, ¿no? Que estos modelos de lenguaje no pueden llevar a la AGI porque no tienen el continual learning, y él ha hecho algunas apreciaciones técnicas. Me parece que, no sé el perfil exactamente de Amodei, pero vamos, no sé Lesus Keber ni Demis Hassabis. No creo que el nivel técnico de la compañía sea el de las explicaciones de Dario Amodei. Con eso tengo que decir que habla mucho de memoria, no comenta para nada el modelo del mundo, que comenta que es uno de los componentes básicos, componente del mundo, modelo del mundo, que memoria, que está relacionado, pero no es exactamente lo mismo que la ventana de contexto. Dice, podemos poner 1 millón o podemos llegar a infinito o lo que sería toda tu vida, ya, pero son cosas distintas, ¿no? En definitiva, se tiene que ir hacia una arquitectura cognitiva, que parece que Demis Hassabis lo tiene muy claro, Iria no ha dado ninguna pincelada al respecto, pero creo que también lo tiene claro en ese sentido, ¿no? Que faltan algunas piezas para que el motor de inteligencia esté completo. Y una de ellas es, Demis Hassabis lo dijo, el modelo del mundo, memoria, y evidentemente tiene que haber una parte de aprendizaje continuo, ¿no? De modelización y de aprendizaje continuo. Pero una cosa es la memoria y otra cosa es cómo tú optimizas tus algoritmos a partir de esa memoria, ¿no? Son cosas diferentes. Vale, pues por aquí hasta aquí. Vamos a seguir.
Obsession with scale might blind you to some of the new techniques, like Demis Hassabis says, to get to AGI, or you might call it super powerful AGI, whatever. Human level intelligence is what we're all talking about. We might need a couple new techniques for that to happen. If
so,
you're so
we're
focused
developing
on scale,
new
can you get there?
techniques. We're developing new techniques every day.
Okay.
Claude is very good at code, and we don't really talk externally that much about why Claude is so good at code.
Why is it so good at code?
Like I said, we don't talk externally about it.
I have to ask.
Every new version of Claude that we make has, improvements to the architecture, improvements to the data that we put into it, improvements to the methods that we use to train it. So we're developing new techniques all the time. New techniques are a part of every model that we build, and that's why we I've said these things about we're trying to optimize for talent density as much as possible. You need that talent density in order to invent the new techniques.
There's one thing that's been hanging over this conversation, which is that maybe Anthropic is the company with the right idea, but the wrong resources. Because you look at what's happening with xAI and inside Meta, where Elon's built his massive cluster. Mark Zuckerberg is building this 5 gigawatt data center, and they are putting so much resources towards scaling up. Is it possible? I mean, Anthropic, obviously, you have raised billions of dollars, but these are trillion-dollar companies.
So we've raised, I think at this point, a little short of $20 billion.
It's not bad.
So that's not nothing. And I would also say, if you look at the size of the data centers that we're building with, for example, Amazon, I don't think our data center scaling is substantially smaller than that of any of the other companies in the space. In many cases, these things are limited by energy, they're limited by capitalization. When people talk about these large amounts of money, they're talking about it over several years, right? And when you hear some of these announcements, sometimes they're not funded yet. We've seen the size of the data centers that folks are building, and we're actually pretty confident that we will be within a rough range of the size of the data centers that they built.
You talked about talent density. What do you think about what Mark Zuckerberg is doing on the talent density front? I mean, combining that with these massive data centers, it seems like he's going to be able to compete.
Yeah, so this is actually very interesting because one thing we noticed is that relative to other companies, I think very a lot fewer people from Anthropic have been caught by these, and it's not for lack of trying. I've talked to plenty of people, who got these offers at Anthropic and who just turned them down, who wouldn't even talk to Mark Zuckerberg, who said, no, I'm staying at Anthropic, and our general response to this was, I posted something to the whole company Slack where I said, look, we are not willing to compromise our compensation principles, our principles of fairness to respond individually to these offers. The way things work at Anthropic is there's a series of levels. When a candidate comes in, they get assigned a level, and we don't negotiate that level because we think it's unfair. We want to have a systematic way. If Mark Zuckerberg throws a dart at a dartboard and hits your name, that doesn't mean that you should be paid 10 times more than the guy next to you who's just as skilled, who's just as talented. And my view of the situation is that the only way you can really be hurt by this is if you allow it to destroy the culture of your company by panicking, by treating people unfairly in an attempt to defend the company. And I think actually this was a unifying moment for the company where, we didn't give in. We refused to compromise our principles because we had the confidence that people are at Anthropic because they truly believe in the mission. And you know, I think that gets to kind of how I see this. I think that what they are doing is trying to buy something that cannot be bought, and that is alignment with the mission. And you know, I think there's selection effects here. Like are they getting the people who are most enthusiastic, who are most mission aligned, who are most excited to?
But they have talent and GPUs. You're not underestimating them.
We'll see how it plays out. I am pretty bearish on what they're trying to do.
So let's talk a little bit about your business, because a lot of people had.
Bueno, en este sentido, con lo de Meta, a ver. Hombre, si te hacen una oferta, dicen, no, hay que defender la cultura de la compañía, etcétera, tú puedes. A ver, vamos a ver, tú eres un profesional. Yo, vamos, no sé si lo aceptaría. Bueno, entiendo que siempre me ofrecen 100 millones de. No lo sé. El dinero no es todo, ¿no? Obviamente. Pero de ahí a defender que tú tienes una escala de salarios y que no van a romper eso, pues bueno, viene alguien que tiene más pasta y dice, pues yo te pago 100 millones. Ya está. Es decir, es que esto es una guerra. Y defenderlo con tu cultura empresarial y que todo tiene que ser equidistante y que no puede ser que tú cobres 10 veces más que el de al lado porque aparezca tu nombre. Esto me parece de una falacia. Y entonces ahí defiendo a Zuckerberg. Esto es la selva. Esto no es. La gente se mueve por dinero y por valores también, obviamente. Pero en definitiva, ¿qué tiene Anthropic? Que es una religión. Al final, si viene Meta y tienen más datacenters, más datos, van a crear un super equipo. Es como el que está jugando en el Villarreal, le llama al Madrid y no quiere. Pues a lo mejor no va al Madrid porque no le gusta el equipo o el Barça, pero si le paga 10 veces más, adiós. Entonces, la excusa esto de la cultura o el escudo.
Been wondering, is the business of generative AI a real thing? And I'm also curious. I have questions all the time. You talked about how much money you've raised, close to 20 billion. You've raised $3 billion from Google, $8 billion from Amazon, $3.5 billion from a new round led by Lightspeed, who I've spoken with. What is your pitch? Because you are not part of like a big tech company. You're out there on your own. Do you just bring the scaling laws and say, "Can I have some money?"
So my view of this has always been that talent is the most important thing. So you know, if you go back 3 years ago, you know, we were in a position where we had raised mere hundreds of millions. OpenAI had already raised, you know, 13 billion from Microsoft, and of course, you know, the large hypercap tech companies were sitting on $100 billion, $200 billion, and basically the pitch we made then is we know how to make these models better than others do, right? There may be a curve of scaling laws, but look, if we are in a position where we can do for 100 million what others can do for $1 billion, and we could do for 10 billion what they can do for 100 billion, then it's 10 times more capital efficient to invest in Anthropic than it is to invest in these other companies. Would you rather be in a position where you can do anything for 10 times cheaper, or where you start with a large pile of money? If you can do things 10 times cheaper, the money is a temporary defect that you can remedy. If you have this intrinsic ability to build things for the same price, much better than anyone else, or as good as anyone else for much lower price, you know, investors aren't idiots, or at least they aren't always idiots.
Depends which one you go to. Yeah.
I'm not going to name any names, but you know, they basically understand the concept of capital efficiency. And so we've been in a position, you know, 3 years ago where, you know, these differences were like 1,000x, and now you're saying, you know, with $20 billion, can you compete? Can you compete with $100 billion? And my answer is basically yes, because of the talent density. You know, I've said this before, but you know, the Anthropic is actually the fastest growing software company in history at the scale that it's at. So we grew from 0 to 100 million in 2023. 100 million to $1 billion in 2024, and this year we've grown from 1 billion to, I think I said this before, 4.5. Right. So that 10x a year. I mean, you know, every year I like suspect that we'll grow at that scale, and every year I'm almost afraid to say it publicly because I'm like, no, it couldn't possibly happen again. So you know, I think the growth at that scale like kind of speaks for itself in terms of our ability to compete with the big players.
Okay, so CNBC says 60 to 75% of Anthropic sales are through the API. That was according to internal documents. Is that still accurate?
I won't give exact numbers, but the majority does come through the API, although we also do have a flourishing apps business, and I think more recently the max tier, which power users use, as well as Claude Code, which coders use. So I think we have a thriving and fast growing apps business, but yes, the majority comes through the API.
So you're making the most pure bet on this technology. Like OpenAI might be betting on ChatGPT, and Google might be betting on the fact that no matter where the technology goes, it can integrate into Gmail and Calendar. So why have you made this bet on the pure bet on the tech itself?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I wouldn't quite put it that way. I think I would describe it more as we've bet on business use cases of the model, more so than we've bet on the API per se. And it's just that the first business use cases of the model come through the API. So, as you mentioned, OpenAI is very focused on the consumer side. Google is very focused on kind of the existing products that Google has. Our view is that, if anything, the enterprise use of AI is going to be greater even than the consumer use of AI. Right? I should say the business use, because it's enterprise, it's startups, it's developers, and it's kind of power users using the model for productivity. I also think that being a company that's focused on the business use cases actually gives us better incentives to make the models better. A thought experiment that I think is worth running is, suppose I have this model and it's as good as an undergrad at biochemistry. And then I improve it and it's as good as a PhD student at biochemistry. If I go to a consumer, right, if I give them the chatbot and I say, great news, I've improved the model from undergrad to graduate level in biochemistry, maybe, I don't know, 1% of consumers care about that at all, right? 99% are just going to be like, I don't understand it either way. But now suppose I go to Pfizer and I say, I've improved this from undergrad at biochemistry to grad at biochemistry. Like, this is going to be the biggest deal in the world, right? They might pay 10 times more for something like that. It might have 10 times more value to them. And so the general aim of making the models solve the problems of the world, to make them smarter and smarter, but also able to bring many of the positive applications, right? The things I wrote about in like Machines of Loving Grace, of like solving the problems of biomedicine, solving the problems of geopolitics, solving the problems of economic development, as well as more prosaic things like finance or legal or productivity or insurance. I think it gives a better incentive to kind of develop the models as far as possible. And I think in many ways it's like it may even be a more positive business. So I would say we're making a bet on the business use of AI because it's most aligned with kind of the exponential.
Okay, then briefly, how did you decide to go with the coding use case?
Yes. So, originally, as happens with most things, we're trying to optimize for making the model better at a bunch of stuff. And, coding particularly stood out in terms of how valuable it was. I've worked with thousands of engineers, and there was a point about a year and a half ago where one of the best I'd ever worked with said, every previous coding model has been useless to me, and this one finally was able to do something I wasn't able to do. And then after we released it, it started getting quick adoption. This was around the time that, a lot of the coding companies like Cursor, Windsurf, GitHub, Augment Code started exploding in popularity. And then when we saw how popular it was, we kind of doubled down on it. My view is that coding is particularly interesting because A, the adoption is fast. And B, getting better at coding with the models actually helps you to develop the next model. So it has a number of I would say advantages.
And now you're selling your AI coding through Claude Code, but it's very interesting. The pricing model has been confounding to some. You can spend $200 a month and get the equivalent. I spoke to one developer; they got the equivalent of $6,000 a month from your API. Ed Zitron has pointed out the more popular that your models get, the more money you're going to lose if people are super users of this technology. So how does that make sense?
So actually pricing schemes and rate limits are surprisingly complicated. So some of this is basically the result of when we released our when we released Claude Code in the Max tier, which we eventually tied together, actually not fully understanding the implications of the ways in which people could use the models and how much they were actually able to get. So over the last few days, as of the time of this interview, we've adjusted that, particularly on the larger models like Opus. I think it's no longer possible to spend that much with a $200 subscription, and it's possible more changes will come in the future. But we're always going to have a distribution of users who use a lot and users who use some amount, and it doesn't necessarily mean we're losing money. That there are some users who get more, who, if you were to measure via API credits, spend, get a better deal on the consumer on the consumer subscription than they would on the API products, right? There's a lot of assumptions there, and I can tell you that some of them are wrong. We are not, in fact, losing money.
But I guess there's another question about whether you can continue to serve these use cases and not raise prices. So just to give you a couple stats, there are some developers that are upset because using Anthropic's newer models in Cursor is costing them more than it ever has. Startups that I've spoken with say Anthropic is down a bunch because they can't get access to the GPUs. At least that's what they imagine is happening. And I was just with Amjad Masad at Replit in an interview that we're going to air next week, who said there was a period of time where the price per token, to use these models, was coming down, and it stopped coming down. So is what's happening that these models are just so expensive for Anthropic to run that it's hitting a wall of its own?
Again, I think you're making assumptions here.
That's why I'm asking the CEO.
The way I think about it is we think about the models in terms of how much value are they creating, right? So as the models get better and better, I think about how much value they create, and there's a separate question about how the value is distributed between those who make the model, those who make the chips, and those who make the underlying applications. So again, without being too specific, I think there are some assumptions in your question that are not necessarily correct.
Can you tell me which ones?
So I'll say this: I do expect I expect the price of providing a given level of intelligence to go down. I expect the price of providing the frontier of intelligence, which will provide kind of increasing economic value, that might go up or it might go down. My guess is it probably stays about where it is. But again, the value that's created, goes way up. So 2 years from now, my guess is that we'll have models that cost of the same order of magnitude that they cost today, except they'll be much more capable of doing work much more autonomously, much more broadly than they are capable of today.
One of the things that Amjad mentioned was he thinks that the bigger models are not as intensive to run or more intensive to run given their size because of the architecture and some of these techniques that we talked about, that they're lighting up only certain sections of the model. So his idea, I'm hopefully conveying this truthfully, is that Anthropic can run these models without too much bulk on the back end, but is still keeping those prices where they are. And I think the line that I'm going to draw there is maybe that to get to software margins, there were some reports that Anthropic is slightly below software gross margins. You're going to have to charge a little bit more for these models.
So I think larger models cost more to run than smaller models.
Okay.
I think the technique you're referring to is maybe mixture of experts or
That's
something
right.
like that.
Yep.
So whether your models are mixture of experts or not, like mixture of experts is like a way to run models more cheaply that have a given number of parameters. It's a way to train models. But if you're not using that technique, then larger models that don't use that technique cost more to run than smaller models that don't use that technique. And if you're using that technique, larger models that use that technique cost more to run than smaller models that are using that technique. So I think that's sort of a distortion of the situation.
Basically, I'm just guessing, and I'm trying to find out what the truth is from you. So.
Yeah, look, so I in terms of like the cost of the models, like one thing you'd be surprised by, people kind of impute this thing to like, oh man, it's going to be really hard to get the margins from like X% to Y%. We make improvements all the time that make the models like 50% more efficient than they are before. We are just at the beginning of optimizing inference. Inference has improved a huge amount from where it was a couple years ago to where it is now. That's why the prices are coming down.
And then how long is it going to take to be profitable? Because I think the loss is going to be like $3 billion this year. That's what they predict.
I would distinguish different things.
Okay.
There's the cost of running the model, right? So for every dollar the model makes, it costs a certain amount. That is actually already fairly profitable. There are separate things. There's, the cost of paying people and like buildings. That is actually not that large in the scheme of things. The big cost is the cost of training the next model. And I think this idea of like the companies losing money and not being profitable it's a little bit misleading. And you start to understand it better when you look at the scaling laws. So as a thought exercise, these numbers are not exact or even close for Anthropic. Let's imagine that in 2023, you train a model that costs $100 million. And then in 2024, you deploy the 2023 model and it makes $200 million in revenue, but you spend $1 billion to train, to train a new model in 2024. So, and then in 2025, the $1 billion model makes $2 billion in revenue, and you spend $10 billion to train the next model. So the company every year is unprofitable. It lost $800 million in 2024, and then in 2025, it lost $8 billion. So this looks like a hugely unprofitable enterprise. But if instead I think in terms of, is each model profitable, right? Think of each model as a venture. I invested $100 million in the model, and then I got $200 million out of the model in the next year. So that model had 50% margins and made me $100 million. The next year, the company invested $1 billion and made $2 billion the next model, the company invested $1 billion and made profitable? So every model is profitable. They're all profitable. But the company is unprofitable every year. I'm not right. This is a style. I'm not like claiming these numbers for Anthropic or claiming these facts but this
is
general,
it true for Anthropic?
This general dynamic is in general terms the explanation for what is going on. Okay. And so at any time, if the models stopped getting better, or if a company stopped investing in the next model, you would have probably a viable business with the existing models, but everyone is investing in the next model. Yeah. And so eventually it'll get to some scale. But the fact that we're spending more to invest in the next model suggests that the scale of the business is going to be larger the next year than it was the year before. Now, of course, what could happen is like the model stopped getting better, and there's this kind of one-time cost that's like a boondoggle, and we spend a bunch of money, but then the companies, the industry will kind of return to this plateau, to this level of profitability, or the exponential can keep going. So I think that's a long-winded way to say I don't think it's really the right way to think about things.
Right, but what about open source? Because if let's say you stopped investing in the models and open source caught up, then people could swap in open source. Now, I'd love to hear your perspective on this, because one of the things people have talked to me about when it comes to the Anthropic business is there is that risk eventually that open source gets good enough that you can take Anthropic out and put open source in.
Yeah, so people have, I think one of the things that's been true of this industry is that, and I saw it early in the history of AI. Every community that AI has gone through, it has this set of heuristics about how things work. Like back when I was in, AI back in 2014, there was an existing kind of AI and machine learning research community that like thought about things in a certain way and were like, this is just a fad, this is a new thing, this can't work, this can't scale. And then because of the exponential, all of those things turned out to be false. Then a similar thing happened with kind of like people deploying AI within companies to various applications. Then there was the same thought in the startup ecosystem. And I think now we're at the phase where kind of the world's business leaders, like the investors and the business, they have this whole lexicon of commoditization, moats, which layer is the value which layer is the value going to accrue to, and open source is this idea that you can kind of see everything that's going on, that it has a significance, that it kind of undermines the fact that the idea that it undermines business. And I actually find, as someone who didn't come from that world at all, who never thought in terms of that lexicon, this is one of these situations where not knowing anything often leads you to make better predictions than kind of the people who have their way of thinking about things from the last generation of tech. And this is all, I think, a long-winded way of saying I don't think open source works the same way in AI that it has worked in other areas. Primarily because with open source, you can see the source code of the model. Here, we can't see inside the model. It's often called open weights instead of open source to kind of distinguish that. But a lot of the benefits, which is that many people can work on it, that it's kind of additive, it doesn't quite work in the same way. I've actually always seen it as a red herring. When I see a new model come out, I don't care whether it's open source or not. Like if we talk about DeepSeek, I don't think it mattered that DeepSeek is open source. I think I ask, is it a good model?
Right.
Is it better than us at the things that's the only thing that I care about. It actually doesn't matter either way, because ultimately you have to host it on the cloud. The people who host it on the cloud do inference. These are big models. They're hard to do inference on. And conversely, many of the things that you can do when you see the weights, we're increasingly offering on clouds where you can fine tune the model. You can we're even looking at ways to kind of investigate the activations of the model as part of like an interpretability interface. We did some little things around steering last time. So I think it's the wrong axis to think in terms of. When I think about competition, I think about like which models are good at the tasks that we do. I think open source is actually a red herring.
But if it's free and cheap to run,
it's not free. You have to run it on inference, and someone has to make it fast on inference.
All right. So I want to learn a little bit more about Dario the person.
Yes.
So we have a little bit of time left. So I have some questions for you about early life.
Bueno, el tema y la reflexión que ha hecho del código fuente. Bueno, yo a veces cuando ves estas charlas de los CEOs de estas compañías que he visto, yo que sé las que he visto, pero esta de Dario Amodei, de momento me parece muy flojita, pero esta reflexión que ha de hacer open source, no, lo que importa es que sea el modelo bueno. Total, lo vas a poner en la nube, pero este hombre, ¿dónde vive? Tiene una visión que defiende su compañía y lo que hace su compañía, pero ¿qué me estás diciendo? ¿Que el open source da igual que DeepSeek haya sido open source? No, para nada. El open source es lo que promueve el desarrollo abierto, el desarrollo gratuito, entre comillas, el que te permita no depender de una compañía, el tener una soberanía que de la otra manera no tienes una auténtica dependencia que puede convertirse en tiranía. No quiero decir lo que están haciendo con Club Code y los diferentes planes, pero ¿qué me está comentando Darío, con lo bien que lo está haciendo tu compañía Anthropic aquí y demuestra ser un líder muy plano.
And then how you became who you are.
Yes.
So what was it like growing up in San Francisco?
Yeah, the city when I first grew up here had not really gentrified that much. When I grew up, the tech boom hadn't happened yet. It happened as I was going through high school, and actually I had no interest in it. It was totally boring to me. I was interested in being like a scientist. I was interested in physics and math, and the idea of like writing some website actually had no interest to me whatsoever, or like founding a company. Like those weren't things that I was interested in at all.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested in discovering fundamental scientific truth, and I was interested in like how can I do something that like makes the world better. So that was kind of more, and I watched the tech boom happen around me, but I feel like there was all kinds of things I probably could have learned from it that would have been helpful now, but I just actually wasn't paying attention and had no interest in it, even though I was like right at the center of it.
So you're the son of a Jewish mother and an
yes.
Italian father.
That is true.
From where I'm from in Long Island, we call that a pizza bagel.
A pizza bagel. I've never heard that term before.
So what was your relationship with your parents like?
Yeah, I mean, I was always pretty close with them. I feel like they gave me a sense of kind of right and wrong and what was important in the world. I feel like kind of imbuing a strong sense of responsibility is maybe the thing that I remember most. They were always people who felt that sense of responsibility and wanted to make the world better. And I feel like that's one of the main things that I learned from them. It was always a very loving family, a very caring family. I was very close with my sister Daniela, who of course became my co-founder. And I think we decided very early that we wanted to work together in some capacity. I don't know if we imagined that it would happen, at quite the scale that it has happened. But it. I think it really, that was something we kind of decided early that we wanted to do.
The people that I've spoken with that have known you through the years have told me that your father's illness had a big impact on you. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes. He was, he was ill for a long time, and eventually died in 2006. So that was actually one of the things that drove me to, I don't think we mentioned it yet in this interview, but before I went into AI, I went into biology. So, I'd gone to, I'd shown up at Princeton, wanting to be a theoretical physicist, and I did some work in cosmology for the first few months of my time there, that was around the time that my father died, and that did have an influence on me and kind of was one of the things that convinced me, to go into biology, to try and address, human illnesses and biological problems. And so I started talking to some of the folks who worked on biophysics and computational neuroscience in the department that I was at Princeton. And that was what led to the switch to biology and computational neuroscience. And then, of course, after that, I eventually went into AI. And the reason I went into AI was actually a continuation of that motivation, which is that, as I spent many years in biology, I realized that the complexity of the underlying problems in biology felt like it was beyond human scale. In order to understand it all, you needed hundreds, thousands of, human researchers, and, they often had a hard time collaborating or sharing their, combining their knowledge. And AI, I was just starting to see the discoveries in it, felt to me like the only technology that could kind of bridge that gap, could bring us beyond human scale to fully understand and solve the problems of biology. So yeah, there is a through line there.
Right, and I could have this wrong, but one thing I heard was that his illness was largely uncurable when he had it, and there have been advances that have been. Can you share a little bit more?
Yes,
there are advances that have made it much more manageable today.
Yes, that is true. Actually, only in the maybe 3 or 4 years after he died, the cure rate for the disease that he had went from 50% to roughly.
Yeah, I mean, it has to have felt so unjust to have your father taken away by something that could have been cured.
It of course, but it also tells you of the urgency of solving the relevant problems. Right, that there was someone who worked on the cure to this disease that managed to cure it and save a bunch of people's lives, but could have saved even more people's lives if they had managed to find that cure a few years earlier than they did. And I think that's one of the tensions here, right? That I think AI has all of these benefits. And I want everyone to get those benefits as soon as possible. I probably understand, better than almost anyone how urgent those benefits are. And so I really understand the stakes when I speak out about AI has these risks and I'm worried about these risks. I get very angry when people call me a doomer. I got really angry when someone's like, this guy's a doomer, he wants to slow things down. You heard what I just said. Like, my father died because of, cures that, could have happened a few years later. I understand the benefit of this technology. When I sat down to write Machines of Loving Grace, I wrote out all the ways that billions of people's lives could be better with this technology. Some of these people who on Twitter, cheer for acceleration, I don't think they have a humanistic sense of the benefit of the technology. Their brain's just full of adrenaline, and they're like, they want to cheer for something, they want to accelerate. I don't get the sense they care. And so when these people call me a doomer, I think they just completely lack any moral credibility in doing that. It really makes me lose respect for them.
And I've been wondering what this word impact has been, because it's come up so often that those who have been around you have said you've been singularly obsessed with having impact. In fact, I spoke with someone who knew you well who said you wouldn't watch Game of Thrones because it wasn't tied to impact, that it was a waste of time, and you wanted to be focused on impact.
Actually, that's not quite right. I wouldn't watch it because it was so negative sum. People were playing such negative. It was like these people start off and they're partly the situation and partly because they're just horrible people. They like create this situation where at the end of it, everyone is like worse off than everyone was before. I'm really excited about like creating positive sum situations.
Okay, I recommend you watch it. It's a great show. But I hear
have
your
watched some
complaints.
parts of it. I was just very reluctant and didn't watch it for a long time.
Let's get back to the impact thing.
Let's get back to the impact.
So that's what impact is effectively your career has been this quest to have that impact, to be able, tell me if I'm going too far, to prevent other people from being in similar situations.
I think that's a piece of it. I mean, I have looked at, many attempts to help people, and some of them are more effective than others. I think I've always tried to, there should be strategy behind it. There should be brains behind, trying to help people. Which often means that there's a long path to it, right? It can run through a company and, many activities that are technical and not immediately tied to the kind of impact that you're trying to have. But, the arc is, I'm always trying to bend the arc towards that. I think that's my picture of it. That's really why I got into this, right? I think, similar to the reason to get into AI was that, I saw the problems of biology as almost intractable without it, or at least too slow moving. I think my reason to start a company was that I had worked at other companies, and I just didn't feel like the way those companies were run was really oriented towards, trying to have that impact. There was a story around it that was often used for recruiting, but it became clear to me over the years that story was not sincere.
I'm going to circle around a little bit because it's clear that you're referring to OpenAI here. From what I understand, you had 50% of OpenAI's compute. I mean, you ran the GPT-3 project. So if anyone was going to be focused on impact and safety, wouldn't have been you.
Yes, I was. There was a period during which that was true. That wasn't true the entire time. That was, for example, when we were scaling up GPT-3. So when I was at OpenAI, I and a lot of my colleagues, including the people who eventually founded Anthropic,
the pandas.
The pandas.
That's the name you gave them.
That isn't a name I gave them.
The name they took.
That isn't a name they took.
That's the name other people called them?
Maybe it's a name other people called them. That's not a name I ever used for my team.
Okay, sorry, go ahead. That's a good clarification. Thank you.
We were involved in scaling up these models. Actually, the original reason for building GPT-2 and GPT-3, it was an outgrowth of the kind of AI alignment work that we were doing, right? Where myself and Paul Cristiano and some of the Anthropic co-founders had invented this technique called RL from human feedback. And that was designed to help steer models in a direction to follow human intent. It was actually a precursor to, we were trying to scale up another method called scalable supervision, which I think is just starting to work many years later to help models follow more kind of scalable human intent. But what we found is even with the more primitive technique, RL from human feedback, it wasn't working with the small language models with GPT-1 that we applied it to and that had been built by other people at OpenAI. And so the scaling up of GPT-2 and GPT-3 was done in order to kind of study these techniques, in order to apply RL from human feedback at scale. this goes to one thing, which is that I think in this field, the alignment of AI systems and the capability of AI systems is intertwined in this way that always ends up being kind of more tied and more intertwined than we think. Actually, what this made me realize is that it's very hard to work on the safety of AI systems and the capability of AI systems separately. It's very hard to work on one and not the other. I actually think the value and the way to inflect the field in a more positive way comes from organizational level decisions. When to release things, when to study things internally, what kind of work to do on systems. And that was one of the things that kind of motivated, me and some of the other, to-be Anthropic founders to kind of go off and do it our own way.
But again, like if you were driving, if you think language, if you think capabilities and safety are interlinked, and you were the guy driving the cutting edge models within OpenAI, if you left, you knew they were going to be a company that was still doing this stuff.
That's right.
It seems like if you're driving the capabilities, you'd be the one in the driver's seat to help it be safe the way that you want it to.
Again, I will say, if there's a decision on releasing a model, if there's a decision on the governance of the company, if there's a decision on, how the personnel of the company works, how the company represents itself externally, the decisions that the company makes with respect to deployment, the claims it makes about how it operates with respect to society. Many of those things are not things that you control just by training the model. And I think trust is really important. I think the leaders of a company, they have to be trustworthy people. They have to be people whose motivations are sincere. No matter how much you're driving the company technically, if you're working for someone whose motivations are not sincere, who's not an honest person, who does not truly want to make the world better, it's not going to work. You're just contributing to something bad.
So then I'm sure you've heard the criticism from people like Jensen who say, well, Dario thinks he's the only one who can build this safely, and therefore, speaking of that word control, wants to control the entire industry.
I've never said anything like that. That's an outrageous lie. That's the most outrageous lie I've ever heard.
By the way, I'm sorry if I got Jensen's words wrong, but
no, the words were correct.
Okay.
But
what he's saying is,
the words are outrageous. In fact, I've said multiple times, and I think Anthropic's actions have shown it, that we're aiming for something we call a race to the top. I've said this on podcasts over the years, and I think Anthropic's actions have shown it, where with a race to the bottom, right? Everyone is competing to get things out as fast as possible. And so I say, when you have a race to the bottom, it doesn't matter who wins, everyone loses, right? Because you make the unsafe system that helps your adversary, or causes economic problems, or is unsafe from an alignment perspective. The way I think about the race to the top is that it doesn't matter who wins, everyone wins, right? So the way the race to the top works is you set an example for how the field works. You say, we're going to engage in this practice. So a key example of this is responsible scaling policies. We were the first to put out a responsible scaling policy. And, we didn't say everyone else should do this or you're bad guys. We didn't kind of try to use it as an advantage. We put it out and then we encouraged everyone else to do it. And then we discovered in the months after that there were people within the other companies who were trying to put out responsible scaling policies, but the fact that we had done it allowed, gave those people permission, right? Kind of enabled those people to make the argument to leadership, hey, Anthropic is doing this, so we should do it as well. The same has been true of investing in interpretability. We release our interpretability research to everyone and allow other companies to copy it, even though we've seen that it sometimes has commercial advantages. Same with things like constitutional AI. Same with the measurement of the dangers of our system, dangerous capabilities evals. So we're trying to set an example for the field. But there's an interplay where it helps to be a powerful commercial competitor. I've said nothing that anywhere near resembles the idea that this company should be the only one to build the technology. I don't know how anyone could ever derive that from anything that I've said. It's just Yeah, it's just an incredible and bad faith distortion.
All right, let's see if we can lightning round like one or two before I ask you the last one, which we'll have 5 minutes for. What happened with SBF? Like,
what happened with SBF?
I mean, he was one of the. Go ahead.
I couldn't tell you.
What was the? Why didn't you answer?
I probably met the guy 4 or 5 times.
Okay.
So I have no great insight into the into the psychology of SBF or why he did things as stupid or immoral as he did. I think the only thing I had ever seen ahead of time with SBF was a couple people mentioned to me that he was like hard to work with, that he was like a bit of a move fast and break things guy. And I was like, okay, there's like plenty of people.
Welcome to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, like welcome to Silicon Valley. And so I remember saying, okay, I'm going to give this guy non-voting shares. I'm not going to put him on the board. He sounds like a bad person to deal with every day. But he's excited about AI. He's excited about AI safety. He's a bull on AI, and he's interested in AI safety. So seems like a sensible thing to do. In retrospect, move fast and break things was turned out to be much more extreme and bad than I ever imagined.
Okay, so let's end here. So you found your impact. I mean, you're working the dream pretty much right now. I mean, think about all the ways that AI can be used for biology, just to start. You also say that this is a dangerous technology. And I'm curious if your desire for impact could be pushing you to accelerate this technology while, potentially devaluing the possibility that controlling it might not be feasible.
So, I think I have more than anyone else in the industry warned about the dangers of the technology, right? We just spent 10, 20 minutes talking about, the frightening, the large array of, people who run, trillion-dollar companies criticizing me for talking about the dangers of these technologies, right? I have U.S. government officials, I have people who run $4 trillion companies criticizing me for talking about the dangers of the technology, right? Imputing all these bizarre motives that bear no relationship to anything I've ever said, not supported in anything I've ever done, and yet I'm going to continue to do it. I actually think that as the revenues, as the economic business of AI ramps up, and it's ramping up exponentially, if I'm right, in a couple years, it'll be the biggest source of revenue in the world, right? It'll be the biggest industry in the world, and people who run companies already think it. So we actually had this terrifying situation where, hundreds of billions to trillions to, I would say, maybe 20 trillion of capitals on the side of accelerate AI as fast as possible. We have this, company that's very valuable in absolute terms, but, looks very small compared to that, right? $60 billion. And I keep speaking up, even if, it makes folks in, there have been these articles, some folks in the US government are upset at us, for example, for opposing the moratorium on AI regulation, for being in favor of export controls for chips on China, for talking about the economic impacts of AI. Every time I do that, I get attacked by many of my peers.
Right, but you're still assuming that.
Hombre, ya entendemos por qué Anthropic está en la primera posición del informe de Future of Life Institute, ¿no? Con lo que está diciendo ahora Dario Amodei. Sí, es que al final todo es muy evidente.
We can control it. That's what I'm pointing out.
But I'm just telling you how much effort, how much persistence, how much, despite everything that's stacked up, despite all the dangers, despite the risk that it has to the company of being willing to speak up, I'm willing to do it. And that's why I'm saying that, look, if I thought that there was no way to control the technology, right? If I thought, even if I thought this is just a gamble, right? Some people are like, oh, you think there's a 5 or 10% chance that AI could go wrong, you're just rolling the dice. That's not the way I think about it. This is a multi-step game, right? You take one step, you build the next step of most powerful models, you have a more intensive testing regime. As we get closer and closer to the more powerful models, I'm speaking up more and more, and I'm taking more and more drastic actions because I'm concerned that the risks of AI are getting closer and closer. We're working to address them. We've made a certain amount of progress, but when I worry that the progress that we've made on the risks does not, is not fully aligned with the, is not going as fast as we need to go for the speed of the technology, then I speed up. Then I speak up louder. And so, you're asking, why am I talking? You started this interview by saying, what's gotten into you? Why are you talking about this? It's because the exponential is getting to the point that I worry that we may have a situation that our ability to handle the risks is not keeping up with the speed of the technology. And that's how I'm responding to it. If I believe that there was no way to control the technology, which I see absolutely no evidence for that proposition. We've gotten better at controlling models with every model that we release, right? All these things go wrong, but you really have to stress test the models pretty hard. That doesn't mean you can't have emergent bad behavior. And I think, if we got to much more powerful models with only the alignment techniques we have now, then I'd be very concerned. Then I'd be out there saying everyone should stop building these things. Even China should stop building these. I don't think they'd listen to me, which is one reason I think export controls is a better measure. But if we got a few years ahead in models and had only the alignment and steering techniques we had today, then I would definitely be advocating for us to slow down a lot. The reason I'm warning about the risk is so that we don't have to slow down, so that we can invest in safety techniques and can continue the progress of the field. It would be a huge economic effort. Even if one company was willing to slow down the technology, that doesn't stop all the other companies. That doesn't stop our geopolitical adversaries to whom this is a existential fight for survival. So, there's very little latitude here, right? We're stuck between all the benefits of the technology, the race to accelerate it, and the fact that is a multi-party race. And so I am doing the best thing I can do, which is to invest in safety technology to speed up the progress of safety. I've written essays on the importance of interpretability, on how important various directions in safety are. We release all of our safety work openly because we think that's the thing that's a public good. That's the thing that everyone needs to share. So if you have a better strategy for balancing the benefits, the inevitability of the technology, and the risks that it face, I am very open to hear it, because I go to sleep every night thinking about it, because I have such an incredible understanding of the stakes in terms of the benefits, in terms of what it can do, the lives that it can save. I've seen that personally. I also have seen the risks personally. We've already seen things go wrong with the models. We have an example of that with Grok, and people dismiss this, but they're not going to laugh anymore when the models are taking actions, when they're manufacturing, and when they're in charge of medical interventions. Right? People can laugh at the risks when the models are just talking, but I think it's very serious. And so I think what this situation demands is a very serious understanding of both the risks and the benefits. These are high stakes decisions. They need to be made with they need to be made with a seriousness. And I think something that makes me very concerned is that on one hand, we have a cadre of people who are just doomers. People call me a doomer, I'm not, but there are doomers out there. People who say they know there's no way to build this safely. I've looked at their arguments. They're a bunch of gobbledygook. The idea that these models have dangers associated with them, including dangers to humanity as a whole, that makes sense to me. The idea that we can kind of logically prove that there's no way to make them safe, that seems like nonsense to me. So I think that is an intellectually and morally unserious way to respond to the situation we're in. I also think it is intellectually and morally unserious for people who are sitting on $20 trillion of capital, who all work together because their incentives are all in the same way. There are dollar signs in all of their eyes. To sit there and say, we shouldn't regulate this technology for 10 years. Anyone who says that we should worry about the safety of these models is someone who just wants to control the technology themselves. That's an outrageous claim, and it's a morally unserious claim. We've sat here and we've done every possible piece of research. We speak up when we believe it's appropriate to do so. We've tried to back up, when we make claims about the economic impact of AI. We have an economic research council. We have a economic index that we use to track the model in real time, and we're giving grants for people to understand the economic impact of the technology. I think for people who are far more financially invested in the success of the technology than I am, to just breezily lob ad hominem attacks, I think that is just as intellectually and morally unserious as the doomers position. I think what we need here is we need more thoughtfulness. We need more honesty. We need more people willing to go against their interest, willing to not have, breezy Twitter fights, hot takes. We need people to actually invest in understanding the situation, actually do the work, actually put out the research, and actually add some light and some insight to the situation that we're in. I am trying to do that. I don't think I'm doing that perfectly, as no human can. I'm trying to do it as well as I can. It would be very helpful if there were others who would try to do the same thing.
Well, Dario, I said this off camera, but I want to make sure to say it on as we're wrapping up. I appreciate how much Anthropic publishes. We have learned a ton from the experiments, everything from red teaming the models to vending machine Claude, which we didn't have a chance to speak about today. But I think the world is better off just to hear everything going on here. And to that note, thank you for sitting down with me and spending so much time together.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks everybody for listening and watching. And we'll see you next time.
Pues flojita. La verdad es que Dario Amodei... A ver, a mí Anthropic es una de las compañías para mí que lo está haciendo mejor junto con Google. Tampoco hay muchas donde elegir, evidentemente, ¿no? Pero xAI, y bueno, la pullita que le tira Dario Amodei a Grok, pero bueno, diciendo las declaraciones que dice Dario, sabemos en qué dirección apunta. Y lo vuelvo a repetir, se entiende muy bien porque en el programa que hicimos analizando ese informe del Future of Life Institute, voy a ponerlo, no me acuerdo. Voy a ponerlo, Future of Life Institute, era un index, a ver, era index, el Safety Index, este de aquí, ¿vale? Hicimos un programa donde, a ver que lo muestre, y en este se puede ver que, bueno, que la empresa número 1, bueno, eso está comandado por Max Tegmark, que es el capo en la sombra, uno de ellos, principios de Asilomar, etcétera. Y ahí tenemos a Anthropic como la empresa más segura, ¿no? La que más hay que confiar. Luego OpenAI, porque se ha mostrado mucho más dispuesta que Google a documentación y a ser transparente con el gobierno. Y bueno, xAI pues fatal, Meta fatal, y las empresas chinas no hay que fiarse. Entonces, claro, estos tópicos, estos mensajes, la verdad es que son dañinos, porque al final te das cuenta estas compañías desde dónde se mueven, ¿no? O lo intuyes. Es cierto que lo está haciendo francamente bien. Yo aventuré una compra por parte de Apple, no sé por qué. Bueno, Apple parece que va a comprar más Mistral que Anthropic, pero hay muchas colaboraciones con Anthropic, pero sería una buena compra, ¿no? Yo creo que posicionaría Apple, habría ahí un posicionamiento importante, ¿no? No lo sé qué ocurrirá. No sé qué ocurrirá porque surgieron noticias que las voy a poner ahora, que de esto nos ha comentado. Me ha parecido una entrevista súper plana. Yo pensaba, bueno, ha dicho dos cosas que son las que estaban como titular, pero vamos, ha sido muy... Me ha gustado mucho la historia personal que ha contado suya, de su padre, la enfermedad, su motivación, eso está bien. A ver, es esta. Bueno, es esta noticia que, bueno, que podría hacer, claro, aquí en Europa se la hubieran cargado. A ver, si Anthropic fuera europea, la hubieran destruido. Por eso hay que irse fuera, si quieres desarrollar algo grande. Y es que están utilizando pues todo el tema de, dice, afrontará una demanda colectiva de escritores, ¿no? Sabéis que Anthropic, la victoria parcial de Anthropic en los tribunales, que amparó su uso justo el entrenamiento de su modelo de inteligencia artificial cloud con libros adquiridos de forma legítima. Compraron libros para que no les dijeran nada y los utilizaron en el entrenamiento, ¿no? Entonces, claro, tú te haces con una copia y lo entrenas el modelo y el modelo sirve a un montón de usuarios, ¿no? Y eso, bueno, no sé si es muy legal. Y entonces dijo que, bueno, una demanda colectiva, descarga masiva de libros, infringió la ley de derechos de autor al descargar millones de obras al estilo Napster, pero ahí lo tienes, Cloud. Potencial indemnización millonaria, al final es dinero. Y nada. Los millones de autores afectados deberían poder beneficiarse de cualquier resultado positivo. Ay, espera, perdona. Me he equivocado. Nuevo juicio previsto para diciembre. Y claro, esto implicaría... Ellos dicen que han hecho un uso justo. Claro, esto lo sitúa en una posible compra. Además, la demanda tecnológica apoyada por Bezos también afronta una reciente denuncia por el uso ilícito de millones de comentarios de sus foros para entrenar la herramienta Cloud. Claro, todo esto, el problema es que, claro, podría constituir el que la empresa estuviera en peligro, claro, si van a saco. Pero lo mismo pasó con OpenAI. Lo que pasa es que aprovecharon ahí un hueco con el tema de que eran open. ¿Qué es lo que subyace? Que el gobierno de Estados Unidos les va a decir hay que priorizar que las empresas estadounidenses de IA estén, vamos, casi que sean inmunes ante la ley. ¿Por qué? Porque están en una guerra con China. No, Estados Unidos no se puede permitir que Anthropic se vaya a la mierda. Porque si se fuera por eso, se irían otras cuantas más. Y el problema es que China no cumple con eso. Entonces tampoco. ¿O qué pasa con ellas? Y en Europa, ¿qué hacemos? ¿Podemos utilizar esos modelos que incumplen también la ley? Es decir, si utilizamos los modelos de Cloud de Anthropic en Europa, estamos siendo ilegales, puesto que como utilizan material que no cumple el copyright, ¿entendéis la barbaridad que es la IACT? ¿Entendéis la barbaridad que es la IACT? Que solo es negocio para los de siempre, para los cuadriculados medievos y demás abogados oportunistas, que hay muchos que no lo son y que buscan el avance y el progreso y que todo esto llegue a buen término. Pues eso. Bueno, chicos, un programa más, una charla con vosotros, una vista a y un análisis a la entrevista de Dario Amodei, muy plana, muy plana. Estoy pensando si esta noche, pero no sé si estaré aquí. Si estoy, a lo mejor la hago de una entrevista que hay de Ilie Suskever. Por la noche, podríamos verla. Y si no, pues ya o la veríamos mañana o mañana veríamos alguno de los programas que están pendientes. Igualmente, gracias por estar ahí, gracias por acompañarme, gracias por seguir haciendo de xHUB.AI este espacio de pensamiento crítico y de encuentro de inteligencia artificial, de conocimiento desde lo técnico, lo filosófico, la actualidad, la opinión. Un abrazo, amigos, nos vemos o esta noche o mañana, ya veremos, según según pasen los acontecimientos, no lo sé, voy a ver.